Okay, we are still on the ciliates and we are now talking about their reproduction. So we know that they're capable of both sexual and asexual reproduction. So we're going to take asexual first. Now, during favorable conditions, they are going to reproduce asexually. So the type of asexual reproduction that they undergo is just simply through mitosis. Now, if you look over to the right at the top, we have a ciliate, and you can see that there's two nuclei. There's a micronucleus, and there's a larger one, the macronucleus. And so what happens is if you follow the arrow to the left, the micronucleus divides by mitosis, and it's going to make a copy. But the macronucleus doesn't do that. It's got a whole lot more DNA, and so what happens to it is the macronucleus just elongates itself, and then you can see here the cell just splits in half, and then we're going to end up with two new cells over to the right. So in this type of mitosis, the only thing that actually divides is that smaller micronucleus. The macronucleus elongates, and then there's division. Now, in sexual reproduction, this involves conjugation, and conjugation is going to be the transferring of the DNA from one to the other. So if we start at the top, here we have got the fusion of opposite mating types. And then the two cells are going to join, and the macronuclei, the larger ones, they disintegrate. You can see that down at the bottom. And then each diploid micronucleus is going to undergo meiosis and produce four haploid micronuclei. Now in this picture, it shows you that the cells are exchanging genetic material during conjugation, but during the process of conjugation, the cells aren't actually producing any new ones. So the two cells are going to have to divide following conjugation. That's what it's up here to produce the four new offspring. So there's actually two things going on there. All right, phylum is Coleophora. Their common name is the ciliates. Their body plan is single-celled, and they contain cilia. That's their motility. Nutrition type, they're heterotrophs, and the most common is from the genus Paramecium. All right, now we're moving into the phylum Apicomplexa, and this is the phylum that all are parasitic. And once upon a time, they were referred to as the sporozoans. I learned them as the sporozoans. They don't use that term so much anymore, but sporozoans are spore producing, and they're all parasitic. Now, the unique thing about Apicomplexa is that there's no means of locomotion. So if there's no means of locomotion, that means they have to burrow into a host and are typically traveling in the bloodstream. Now here on the left, it shows you what a typical apicomplexan looks like, and they do have pretty involved asexual and sexual reproduction, and sometimes their life cycle includes more than one host. So if you look at them, the apical part is at the top. So there is an apex or peak to one side of them. And what happens is they use this complex up here. There's some organelles, some micronemes, and some other organelles in that complex that allow them to enter the host or burrow through the host cell or their tissue. I am not going to ask you about micronemes and these particular organelles, so don't worry about these. Just know that in the apical complex, or the prominence up here, it is designed to be able to gain entry into the host. Now, what happens is during reproduction, they form what's called a sporozoite, and that's an infectious cell that is protected by a resistant coat. So, this is what makes them a little bit difficult to cure because the sporozoite itself is permeable to a lot of medications. And we'll talk about these a little bit more with malaria. On your sheet, I didn't mention merozoites and sporozoites, but they're just two forms of the same protist, and they go back and forth when they're going back from the bloodstream into the liver. All right, now I said I'm not going to ask you about their life cycle because they're all different, and they do involve um, a host cell is in maybe more than one host cell, and maybe even more than a different cell. So, like malaria, we're having to go from the liver, which is your primary site of reproduction, into the red blood cell. So, they do very often require one or more different hosts to complete their life cycle. So here you can look at this. The Anopheles mosquito has to inject its plasmodium into the cell, and it penetrates and goes to the liver where it's going to reproduce for the first time. Now this is just showing how it gets into the salivary gland. So this is a pretty involved picture. I'm not going to put this on your test or ask you about this portion down here, but you do need to know that when it injects here, the sporozoite is in the sporozoite form because it does have that hard covering, and it penetrates the liver cell. And then what happens is it reproduces in the liver, and then it's going to leave and it's going to go into the red blood cell. When it's in the red blood cell, it's actually in the form of a merozoite because the merozoites are the babies. And then it's going to repeat its cycle every 24 to 48 hours. Okay, as apicomplexans inhabit a host cell, what happens is the um, the parasite itself absorbs all the nutrients and it destroys the host cell. So you can see that here. These are red blood cells. And apicomplexans may have killed more people than any other group of pathogens on Earth. Malaria comes in as one of the top diseases when it comes to all of the diseases, not just diseases if you don't separate them into bacterial and viral. I mean, malaria is a huge problem in a lot of parts of the world, not here, but in a large part. In that Anopheles mosquito is your vector, and it's in tropical and subtropical areas because it can live, not only does it live in warm weather, but there's no cold cycle in those, there's no cold weather in order to kill them. So they can not only live out their life cycle, but they can reproduce like crazy. And of course, we know that mosquitoes also like to have a moist environment. So not only do they not have a period of time where they die, like here, hopefully it gets cold enough to where the mosquitoes die. I'm not sure that they ever really do, but in subtropical areas, they don't. So they can live year round, they can reproduce year round, and that's what causes those areas to be so heavily infested with malaria.